Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Life Up Podcast. You know how it is, those classic parenting moments that sometimes feel like they're straight out of a sitcom.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
We're rushing to get out the door in the morning. Shoes have mysteriously vanished.
Yeah.
Breakfast is declared absolutely inedible, and then bam, your sweet little one erupts into a full-blown meltdown because their socks feel weird.
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe you're navigating the teenage years where every suggestion is met with eye rolls and a lecture on how you just don't understand.
It's like a universal experience.
It is. Isn't it those moments when you just feel lost in the whirlwind of raising kids and wondering if there's a calmer, a more connected way to do this whole parenting thing?
Like you're just constantly putting out fires.
Exactly. Just reacting all the time.
Right, and wondering if there's a way to be a bit more grounded, more intentional.
Yes. And that's exactly why we're here today. We're diving deep into the world of Becky Kennedy and her fantastic book, Good Inside.
A book filled with so much wisdom and practical advice.
It really is. And for this deep dive, we're going straight to the source, excerpts from Good Inside by Becky Kennedy. Our mission is to uncover those core principles that can really shift things for parents. You know, the ones that can help us create a more peaceful, more connected family life.
The kind of principles that can make you feel like you have a new roadmap.
Exactly. And it all starts with understanding why our kids, and let's be honest ourselves, act the way we do.
That's a huge part of it, right?
It is. And Becky Kennedy reminds us that there's this inherent goodness inside all of us. And finding a way to see that even when things get tough.
It's like changing the lens through which we view those everyday parenting challenges.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. What is the absolute bedrock of Becky Kennedy's approach? What's the foundation she builds everything else on?
Well, it all starts with this really powerful idea that she calls good inside.
Good inside.
Yeah, it's this fundamental belief that at their core, both you and your children are inherently good, even when their behavior isn't so good.
Even in the midst of those meltdowns. The back talk, the times when you're pretty sure they're trying to drive you up the wall.
Exactly. Even then, that good inside is still there.
So how does this idea of good inside actually play out in real life? Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about a time when maybe you've labeled your child as a spoiled brat in a moment of frustration.
Been there.
Or you know your child is adamantly denying doing something even though you saw them do it.
Classic.
Kennedy's point is that even beneath those frustrating actions, that fundamental good inside remains.
Okay, so how does this shift in perspective actually help parents in those tough moments?
Well, instead of immediately reacting with anger or frustration, this belief encourages you to become a bit of a detective, to start asking what's going on here.
So it's about curiosity rather than judgment.
Precisely. Instead of thinking, my kid is deliberately trying to make my life miserable, you start to wonder what unmet need or feeling might be driving this behavior.
Because there's always a reason behind the behavior.
Always. And this approach also encourages us to look inward, to ask, what am I bringing to this situation emotionally?
Oh, that's so important. Our own stuff can absolutely influence how we react to our kids.
Absolutely.
Now, it's interesting because she points out that a lot of traditional parenting approaches operate from a very different starting point, almost the opposite of good inside.
Right. It's like this underlying belief that kids are inherently prone to bad behavior and they need to be controlled or corrected.
And so those approaches often rely heavily on punishments and rewards.
Yes, exactly. Like timeouts or taking away privileges or conversely offering stickers and treats for good behavior.
Whereas the good inside approach is much more about understanding the internal world that's driving the behavior.
It's about getting to the root of things.
But I think it's really important for us to clarify here that believing in the good inside doesn't mean letting kids run wild.
No, absolutely not. It doesn't mean there are no boundaries.
It's not permissive parenting.
Not at all. Kennedy is crystal clear about that. You can absolutely believe in your child's inherent goodness and still set firm limits on unacceptable behavior.
Like hitting, yelling, being disrespectful.
Exactly. It's about separating the person from the action.
And that applies to us as parents too.
Oh, 100%.
How often do we beat ourselves up over our parenting mistakes?
Yeah.
Replaying those moments when we lost our cool and questioning our entire ability to do this whole parenting thing, right?
All the time, right?
All the time. And Becky Kennedy really emphasizes recognizing our own inherent goodness as parents as the starting point for making any positive changes.
Yeah, if you're constantly caught up in self-criticism and guilt, it's so much harder to show up as the patient, understanding parent you want to be.
Right. It's like trying to pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
And this is where she introduces this really powerful concept of being a cycle breaker.
Oh, yes. That's such a key idea.
It's about consciously choosing to stop those damaging intergenerational patterns of parenting. The ones that maybe we experienced ourselves.
The things our parents did that we swore we'd never do.
Exactly, and choosing to do things differently.
It's about recognizing that we have the power to change the script.
And that starts with believing in our own good inside.
It does, because when you truly believe in your own goodness, it allows you to tap into that deep desire to be a better parent.
To break free from those old patterns and respond to our kids in ways that nurture their own sense of good inside.
Exactly. It's about choosing connection over reaction.
So powerful. Okay, we've got this foundational principle of good inside as our starting point. Now, what's the next key principle that builds upon that foundation?
Well, building directly on good inside is this idea that two things are true.
Two things are true. Okay, that sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
At its heart, it's the ability to accept and hold multiple realities, feelings, and perspectives all at the same time.
So it's about moving beyond that black and white thinking. The idea that there's only one right answer or one valid emotion in any situation.
Exactly, and it's so valuable in relationships, especially with kids who are still learning to navigate their own big and often conflicting emotions.
It's about understanding that their feelings are real and valid, even if we don't agree with their behavior.
Precisely, and it shifts the focus away from trying to convince them that they're wrong.
Right, it's not about winning the argument.
It's about creating a space where everyone feels seen and heard.
And that understanding, that feeling of being understood, is what builds those secure connections.
Exactly.
She gives us a really relatable example in the book about getting a raise at work.
Oh yeah, the one where you're happy to have a job but also disappointed about the raise.
Right, like those two feelings can coexist and they're both completely valid.
Totally. And Kennedy contrasts that with the boss who can only see one thing being true. That the employee should just be grateful they still have a job.
And that kind of response just shuts down the other person's emotional reality.
Completely.
Okay, so how does this two things are true principle actually play out in parenting?
Well, it's about being able to hold a firm boundary while also acknowledging and validating your child's often very big feelings about that boundary.
Give us an example.
Okay, so let's say it's bedtime and your child wants to watch just one more episode of their favorite show.
Always just one more.
Right, so you hold the boundary and say, no, it's time for bed now. But you also acknowledge their disappointment or frustration. You might say something like, I know you're really sad that you can't watch another episode, and it's okay to feel that way.
So you're not dismissing their feelings, you're just holding firm on the limit you've set.
Exactly, and it shifts the dynamic away from this adversarial me versus you power struggle.
It creates more of a we're in this together kind of feeling.
Exactly, it becomes me and you against this bedtime problem.
I love that she also uses this really helpful example about a child who doesn't want to wear a jacket.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Instead of just insisting the child wear a jacket because it's cold out. The parent takes a moment to understand the child's perspective that they don't feel cold.
Right, and they might say something like, hey, I'm a little worried that you'll be cold outside. You're telling me you don't feel cold right now. Did I get that right?
And that opens up a space for dialogue and potentially for coming up with a solution together.
Instead of just launching into a power struggle.
Exactly. And what I love is that she points out that this two things are true. Principle isn't just a parenting tool.
Right, it's a life tool.
It applies to all of our relationships with partners, friends, family, even our relationship with ourselves.
Absolutely. It allows for more empathy, a deeper understanding, and just more compassionate interactions all around.
Okay, so we've got this foundation of good inside and this idea that two things are true. Now, within this framework, what does Becky Kennedy say is our primary job as parents?
Our number one job is to keep our kids safe.
Safe in what sense?
Safe in every sense, physically and emotionally. And she emphasizes that boundaries are absolutely essential for creating that safety.
Safety first, even before immediate happiness or our kids always liking us.
Exactly, because when a child feels like their parent can't or won't keep them safe, it can be really unsettling.
Subconsciously, they're getting the message that their big emotions are too much for their parents to handle.
Right, and that can be a really scary feeling for a kid.
So even though they might not thank us in the heat of the moment, setting those firm boundaries is actually giving them this underlying sense of security.
It's like saying, I'm here for you, I can handle your big feelings, and I'll keep you safe.
And that helps them learn to regulate their own emotions over time.
Precisely.
And she's very specific about what is not our job as parents, right? We can't control every single urge or desire our kids have.
Especially when they're developmentally not capable of that kind of self-control.
Right, because developmentally they still need our help to manage those big feelings and impulses.
They need us to be that external container, that safe and loving boundary.
So what's an example of what that might look like?
Let's say you have a toddler who's hitting out of frustration. Simply yelling, "Stop hitting," isn't really helpful.
Right, because it doesn't address the feeling behind the behavior.
Exactly. But if you gently hold their hand and say calmly, "I'm not going to let you hit," while also acknowledging their anger, "I see that you're really angry right now," that provides that containment they need.
That makes so much sense. Okay, so we're providing safety through boundaries, but how do we navigate those big emotions that inevitably come up, either in response to those boundaries or just in the course of daily life?
That brings us to another really key principle, reducing shame and increasing connection.
And this is where validation and empathy come in.
Exactly.
Now, those terms get thrown around a lot in the parenting world, but how does Becky Kennedy define them specifically?
She describes invalidation as dismissing or ignoring someone's feelings or experiences.
By telling them they shouldn't feel a certain way.
Exactly. And she says it's like trying to borrow their sense of reality.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It is. When our emotions are consistently dismissed or told they shouldn't exist, we tend to become more emotionally dysregulated.
Because deep down, we're being told that our inner experience isn't real or valid.
Exactly. And that can be really damaging.
Especially for kids who are still learning about their emotions.
Absolutely.
So what's the antidote to that? What's the opposite of invalidation?
Empathy.
And how does she define empathy?
It's our ability to truly understand and relate to another person's feelings, even if we don't agree with their actions.
It's about seeing the world through their eyes.
Exactly. And it starts with validation, which is simply acknowledging and accepting the reality of their emotional experience.
So even if you don't understand why your child is having a meltdown, you can still say something like, "I see you're feeling really angry right now."
Exactly. And then empathy follows, which is about trying to connect with those feelings without trying to immediately fix them or make them disappear.
Because sometimes all a child really needs is to feel heard and understood.
Precisely. And when they feel that sense of being felt, it actually helps them learn to regulate those big emotions on their own.
So interesting.
It's like their body senses that presence and understanding, and it calms the nervous system.
So by allowing and even validating those big feelings, even the tough ones like anger or sadness,
Yeah.
we can actually reduce the likelihood of those feelings escalating into negative behaviors.
That's right. It's the difference between a child feeling safe enough to say, "I'm so mad at my brother," and a child who feels like they can't express their anger, lashing out physically.
Because when feelings are suppressed or ignored, they often come out sideways.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're starting to get a much clearer picture of this approach. The importance of good inside, holding two things are true, our role as safety providers, and the power of connection and empathy. Now, what about the impact of those early years of childhood? Are they really as critical as we often hear?
Becky Kennedy dedicates a whole section of her book to this, and she says those early years are incredibly formative.
Formative in what way?
Well, even though kids won't have explicit memories of everything that happens in those first few years, she argues that those experiences are still shaping them in a really profound way. Like how...
It's like they're laying down the blueprint for how they experience and interact with the world.
So it's shaping their sense of safety and security, their beliefs about themselves and their relationships.
Exactly, and those early interactions with their primary caregivers are particularly important.
Because those interactions are teaching them whether their needs will be met, whether the world is a safe place.
Right, and whether their feelings are acceptable.
And she uses those really clear examples of how different parental responses to a child's distress can lead to very different attachment lessons.
Oh yeah, the ice cream tantrum example.
Right, like the parent who responds with anger or by isolating the child, they're inadvertently teaching the child that their big feelings push people away.
Whereas the parent who acknowledges the child's feelings even amidst the tantrum is helping to build that sense of security.
That feeling that my feelings are okay and I'm still loved even when I'm upset.
That's so powerful. Now this can be a little bit scary for some parents to think about, right? Because what if we weren't always the most attuned or responsive parent in those early years?
I think it's a common worry.
Definitely. So what does Becky Kennedy say to parents who might be struggling with some guilt or anxiety about that?
She offers a lot of reassurance. She emphasizes that the brain is incredibly adaptable. It can rewire itself.
So it's never too late to make positive changes.
Never.
She even suggests skipping ahead to the chapter on self-care if those feelings of guilt get too intense.
Yeah, because you can always come back to this material later when you're feeling a little bit more grounded.
That's a good tip.
Yeah.
Now, she also briefly mentions 2 other psychological models that can be helpful in understanding those early years.
Attachment theory and internal family systems.
Can you give us a really brief overview of those?
Sure, attachment theory, which was developed by John Bowlby, highlights this innate drive in babies to attach to their caregivers for comfort and protection.
It's like a biological imperative.
It is. And those early interactions, those moments of responsiveness or lack thereof from caregivers, teach babies some really crucial lessons.
Lessons about whether the world is a safe and predictable place.
Exactly. And those early experiences form the basis of their attachment style.
Okay, and what about internal family systems?
That's a model of psychotherapy that views the psyche as comprised of different parts or subpersonalities.
And the idea is that by understanding these different parts and how they interact, we can heal internal conflicts and create more harmony within ourselves.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Okay, so we're really starting to see how those early experiences lay the groundwork for our emotional development. The good news is that even if those early attachment patterns weren't secure, they can still be changed
That's the hopeful part.
through consistent positive relationships and those moments of repair.
Exactly. It's about shifting from a place of this is all my fault to I have the responsibility and the opportunity to create a more supportive environment moving forward.
It's empowering, isn't it?
It really is.
Okay, so switching gears a little bit, Becky Kennedy also talks about this idea that fostering resilience in our children is actually more important than just focusing on their happiness.
Yes, and it's kind of a countercultural idea in our culture that's so obsessed with happiness.
Why does she think resilience is so crucial?
She argues that resilience, which is the ability to navigate and regulate distress, is a far more valuable life skill.
Because life is full of challenges and disappointments.
It is. And if we haven't learned how to cope with those difficult emotions, they can become really overwhelming.
She uses this great analogy of an emotion jar, doesn't she?
She does. Imagine all of the human emotions, joy, sadness, anger, fear, all floating around in this jar.
Okay, I can picture it.
And when we don't have the skills to cope with those uncomfortable emotions like disappointment or frustration, they can start to take up way too much space in that jar.
And when the jar gets too full, our bodies go into stress mode.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily the negative emotions themselves that are the problem.
It's our inability to deal with them effectively. And from this idea, she introduces the concept of fear of fear.
Right, the underlying anxiety that comes from feeling like we shouldn't be feeling the way we're feeling.
It's that resistance to our own emotional experience that often makes things so much worse.
Exactly.
So building resilience is fundamentally about learning to tolerate and process those inevitable, difficult emotions.
And expanding our capacity to hold a wider range of emotional experiences without becoming completely overwhelmed.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when our kids are exhibiting what we often label as challenging behaviors, Becky Kennedy encourages us to see those behaviors as a window. What is she saying these behaviors are a window into?
She's saying that they're clues into a child's inner world. You know, their feelings, thoughts, needs, and struggles.
So instead of just focusing on stopping the behavior,
We need to try to understand what's going on beneath the surface.
like detectives.
Exactly.
She gives that example of the partner who throws the cereal box across the room.
Right, the immediate reaction might be to label that as disrespectful.
But if you look through that window of behavior, you might see that the person is actually feeling overwhelmed and unheard.
Exactly, and reacting with punishment only addresses the surface behavior.
It doesn't get to the heart of the matter
Right, and that's why those behavior modification techniques often fail in the long run.
because they're not addressing the root cause.
They miss the core struggle, and they can actually damage the connection between parent and child.
Which is the opposite of what we want.
Exactly.
Instead, she emphasizes building what she calls connection capital.
Right, that reserve of positive feelings, trust, understanding, and mutual respect that you build up in your relationship.
It's like making deposits into an emotional bank account.
That's a great analogy. And when you have that strong foundation of connection, it makes it so much easier to navigate those challenging moments.
Because you have something to draw on when those inevitable withdrawals happen.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a really helpful framework for understanding behavior. Now, Becky Kennedy offers so many practical strategies for putting all of this into practice.
She really gives you a whole toolkit.
Where do we even begin?
Well, she starts with a really important mindset shift that she calls the most generous interpretation, or MGI for short.
Tell us about MGI.
It's about consciously asking yourself, what's the most generous interpretation of this behavior?
So instead of assuming the worst,
You try to see the situation from a more compassionate perspective.
what might they be feeling? What need might they be trying to communicate?
Exactly. Like in that cereal box example, the MGI might lead you to realize that your partner wasn't trying to be disrespectful. They were just feeling really overwhelmed and needing some connection.
And once you've considered the MGI, then you can respond to that underlying need or feeling rather than just reacting to the behavior itself.
Right. So in that example, the parent, after considering the MGI, acknowledged their partner's need for connection, and they came up with a solution together.
Now, some parents might worry that this approach is kind of like rewarding bad behavior.
Right. I think that's a common concern.
But Kennedy clarifies that the goal isn't to reward the behavior, but to understand and meet the need that's driving it.
And she says that when you proactively build that connection capital, those challenging behaviors actually become less likely to happen in the first place.
That makes sense. Okay, what's another one of those key practical strategies?
Well, she talks a lot about the importance of what she calls PNP time.
PNP time. What does PNP stand for?
It stands for positive no pressure time.
Okay, tell us more.
It's basically dedicated time where you give your child your full undivided attention and you let them completely lead the activity.
So no directing, correcting, or teaching moments.
Nope. It's all about entering their world and following their lead.
So you might be building a tower out of blocks, or having a tea party with stuffed animals, or just rolling around on the floor being silly.
Whatever they choose.
And how much time are we talking about?
She suggests aiming for about 10 to 15 minutes a day.
That's doable even for the busiest parents.
It is, and it makes a huge difference. It communicates to your child that they are seen, valued, and loved.
And it fills up that connection capital account.
Exactly.
What about the fill-up game? When does that come in handy?
The fill-up game is really helpful for kids who are struggling with transitions or who are just generally feeling a little disconnected.
It's about intentionally filling up their connection tank.
Exactly. So if your child is acting out in ways that seem to be seeking attention, even negative attention, it might be a sign that they're craving connection.
And so you would proactively give them some positive attention.
Right, like snuggling up and reading a book together or playing a game.
I can see how that would be helpful. Now, she also talks about this idea of emotional vaccination.
Oh, yes, that's a great one.
What's that all about?
It's about preparing your child for a potentially challenging situation ahead of time.
So like before a doctor's appointment or the first day of school.
Exactly. You might talk about what to expect, validate any feelings of nervousness they might have, and even role-play different scenarios.
So you're kind of building up their emotion regulation antibodies.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued by this concept of the feeling bench. Can you explain that one?
The feeling bench is a metaphor for just being with your child in the midst of their difficult emotions without trying to fix them or make them go away.
It's about acknowledging and validating their experience without trying to change it.
Exactly, because sometimes all a child needs is for someone to sit with them on that bench of difficult feelings and just be present.
It's like saying, I see you, I hear you, and I'm here for you.
Exactly.
She also really emphasizes the power of playfulness.
Oh, yes. Playfulness is so important.
It's not just about having fun, it's about building connection and reducing stress.
It really is. Laughter is incredibly healing, and it sends a powerful message to our kids that we enjoy being with them.
That our relationship is a source of joy.
Exactly.
And she encourages parents to tap into their own inner child.
Right, because playfulness isn't always easy, especially if it wasn't modeled for us growing up.
But it's worth the effort.
It really is.
Now, there's this other strategy that I find really interesting. Did I ever tell you about the time strategy?
Oh, that's a good one.
What's the thinking behind that one?
It's about sharing personal stories with your child, about times when you experienced similar struggles or made mistakes.
It's a way of saying, hey, I've been there, I get it.
Exactly. And it can be really helpful because it takes the focus off of their current behavior and turns it into a shared human experience.
It normalizes their struggles and makes them feel less alone.
And it can also be a way to teach problem-solving skills indirectly.
Because you're modeling how you handled a similar situation.
Right.
It's incredible how many different strategies Becky Kennedy offers. And in her book, she goes into even more specific approaches for dealing with tantrums, sibling rivalry, rudeness and defiance, whining, lying, fears, and anxieties.
She covers so much.
Frustration tolerance, food interactions, consent, tears, confidence, perfectionism, separation, anxiety, sleep struggles.
It's really comprehensive.
And she even has specific advice for supporting those deeply feeling kids.
The ones who just experience emotions so intensely.
Yes, and she emphasizes the importance of telling the truth to our children,
And of course, taking care of ourselves.
which is so important because we can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into good inside, what are the absolute key takeaways that you hope listeners will remember?
I think the most important things to remember are first that we all have good inside, both us and our kids.
That's the foundation.
It is. And then this idea that two things can be true at the same time.
We don't have to choose one right answer or one right feeling.
Exactly. And then understanding our primary role as parents, which is to provide safety through clear and consistent boundaries.
And remembering that connection is so much more effective than trying to control our kids' behavior.
And finally, the importance of repair, because we all make mistakes as parents.
We're all human.
Exactly.
And how can putting these principles into practice actually change things for families?
Well, when we move away from that place of judgment and control, and we start to cultivate curiosity, empathy, and connection,
It creates a much more peaceful and harmonious environment.
it does. It really reduces those power struggles and those feelings of overwhelm.
And it helps us to see our kids and ourselves with more compassion and understanding.
Exactly.
So for our final thought today, we encourage you to take a moment and reflect on one specific parenting challenge that you're currently facing. And ask yourself, how might one of these principles offer you a fresh perspective or a new approach?
Right, like how might the belief in your child's good inside, or the idea that two things are true, shift your reaction in that situation?
It's about understanding that there's always more going on beneath the surface.
And that's where real change happens.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into good inside. We hope these insights have been helpful,
We hope so too.
and we look forward to exploring more together in our next episode. Until then, take good care.
See you next time.